In 1892, in the Missouri Ozarks, where families lived far apart and strangers were not welcome, twin sisters Elizabeth and Mave Barrow kept a secret that would stain the land forever. Their father, who was bedridden, called it Providence when their cousin Thomas, who was an orphan, came. Thomas would keep their bloodline alive. He was chained in the cellar for 4 years, a husband in a holy union. When a baby was born, they had a terrible fate that was too horrible to talk about. The sisters' bodies were found in their brother's well in 1896, along with a confession. Their faith was their weapon, and their sin was beyond belief. In 1892, in the farthest parts of Tenney County, Missouri, there was a world that time seemed to have forgotten. The Ozark Mountains were a long line of dense forest and limestone ridges that went on and on. A man could disappear into their hollows and never be found. This was not the romanticized frontier that most people think of. It was a harsher place where you had to rely on yourself completely to survive, and your closest neighbor might be an hour's walk away through dangerous terrain. Roads were just rutted paths that turned into impassable quagmires during storms, which meant that whole communities were cut off for weeks at a time. During the winter, the isolation was complete. Families who lived in these hollows were often Appalachian migrants who had chosen to live in a remote area. They brought with them a strong sense of independence and a strong distrust of the government, the law, and anyone who asked too many questions. The Barrow homestead was at the end of one of these hollows, 15 miles from Forsyth, the nearest town. The property itself was not very interesting for the frontier. It was a small log cabin with a stone chimney and a root cellar dug deep into the hillside to keep food cool in the hot summers of the Ozarks. The Barrow place was famous, not because of how it was built, but because of its reputation. People in town knew Josiah Barrow, the patriarch, as a man with strong and unusual religious beliefs. When he went out to get supplies, which didn't happen very often, he would talk in biblical rhythms about how corrupt modern society is and how important it is to keep your family away from worldly things. Storekeepers and townspeople learned not to talk to him. They just went about their business and watched as he loaded his wagon and disappeared into the woods. Josiah's wife had died years before, but no one could remember how. After she died, Josiah went to town even less often. People saw Elizabeth and Mave, the twin daughters, even less often than their father. When they did come to town, which was usually to buy fabric or lamp oil, they moved through like ghosts, dressed the same in plain homespun, with blank faces and downcast eyes. They only spoke when they had to, and their voices were so soft that shopkeepers had to lean in to hear them. Women in the area who tried to start friendly conversations were met with silence or short answers. Later, the wife of one storekeeper said that the sisters looked like 2 deer that had wandered into a clearing with every muscle ready to run at the slightest sound. The way they moved and gestured in perfect sync with each other was unsettling, as if they had one mind split between 2 bodies. People who lived near the Barrow property said that it was always eerily quiet. There were no sounds of people talking or laughing, just the normal sounds of farm work being done in silence. There was one more member of the Barrow family, but he was rarely talked about and even less often seen. Silas Barrow, the older brother, had moved away from the family home years before to live deeper in the woods. He built a rough cabin miles away from any other house and lived by hunting and trapping. He traded pelts for the few things he couldn't make himself. Local hunters sometimes saw him moving through the woods. He was a thin, bearded man who disappeared into the underbrush as soon as he saw another person. Over the years, stories grew around Silas, as they always do around people who live alone. Some people said he was dumb, while others said he had gone wild and lived more like an animal than a person. Kids scared each other with stories about the wild man of the hollows, even though most of them had never seen him and never would. Silas Barrow really just wanted to be left alone, and in the huge, empty Ozark wilderness, that was very possible. Thomas came to this lonely place in the spring of 1888. He was 17 years old and had lost both of his parents to the flu within days of each other. Thomas was a distant cousin on his mother's side, and the Barrows were the only family members who were willing to take him in. For a few months that year, Thomas was occasionally seen accompanying the sisters on their infrequent trips to town. People said he was a thin, quiet boy with dark hair who was nervous and seemed happy to have found a home after losing someone. He helped put things into the wagon and stood a little away from the twins, as if he wasn't sure where he fit in with this new family. Thomas stopped coming around when fall came and the leaves started to change. When the sisters went back to the storekeeper's wife asked about Thomas. Maeve, or maybe it was Elizabeth, no one could ever tell them apart, said that Thomas had become restless and left to look for work in Springfield, or maybe Kansas City. It was a common story back then. Young men often left rural areas to go to cities that were growing and promised to pay them well. No one thought to ask any more questions. But inside the Barrow home, things were different. Josiah Barrow, who was bedridden because of a stroke that had left him partially paralyzed but still mentally active in a strange way, called his daughters to his bedside soon after Thomas got there. He told them that Providence had sent the boy to them in a voice that shook with what he thought was divine inspiration. Their family line was pure and free of the moral decay that was going on in the outside world. It was their sacred duty to keep it that way. He said that Thomas was meant to be their husband, but not in the legal sense, which would require the involvement of worldly authorities they hated. Instead, he meant it in the spiritual sense that mattered to God. The twins, who had only known their father's authority their whole lives and had been raised on his strict ideas of family sanctity and separation, accepted this statement without question. What they did next would stay a secret for years, hidden as deeply as the root cellar, where they kept their cousin chained. There was no sound for 4 years. Sheriff Reuben Galloway was sitting in his office in Forsyth in 1896, reading a letter that had come in the mail from Illinois. The handwriting was neat and educated. It was from a woman named Martha Hendress, who said she was Thomas's aunt. Thomas had gone to live with his Barrow cousins 8 years before. She said that she had written Thomas several letters over the years, sending them to General Delivery and Forsyth, but he had never responded. She knew that young men often didn't write back, but the complete lack of communication bothered her. Could the sheriff please check on her nephew's health? Galloway folded the letter and looked out his window at the town square, where women were shopping for dry goods and farmers were loading wagons. He was 58 years old and had been a tracker in the Union Army. He had seen a lot of violence during the war and came to the Ozarks to find peace. He had been sheriff for almost 15 years, which mostly meant settling property disputes, catching the odd horse thief, and turning a blind eye to the moonshine operations that everyone knew were going on in the remote hollows. Cases of missing people in the Ozarks were hard to solve. Young men were always leaving to look for work elsewhere. Women got married and moved away. People sometimes just walked into the woods and were never seen again, either by accident or on purpose. The distances were huge. The people were spread out, and keeping track of things was hit or miss at best. Galloway didn't have any deputies in the far-off areas because he could barely pay the 2 men who worked in town. Travelers brought news and irregular post riders delivered mail, but that was about it for communication. In one hollow, a man could kill someone, and no one in the next hollow would hear about it for months, if at all. This was how law enforcement worked in rural areas in 1896, and Galloway knew that his power only went as far as the communities were willing to accept it. In places like the deep hollows where the Barrows lived, people didn't know who they were very well. The letter from Illinois, on the other hand, kept bothering him. Galloway was naturally methodical, which helped him stay alive during the war and helped him do his job as a lawman. He first asked people in town, like store owners and locals, if they remembered the boy. A few did. A quiet young man who had moved in with the Barrow sisters. But no one could remember seeing him after that first fall. Everyone thought he had gone to the city, but no one could be sure. The storekeeper's wife said she had asked about him once and been told he had gone to look for work. It seemed likely enough. Galloway chose to ride out to the Barrow place himself, ask a few questions, and hopefully write back to the worried aunt with some clear answers. It took most of the day to ride. Galloway went south on the main road for a few miles before turning onto a narrow path that wound through woods that were getting thicker. The path was barely kept up, and the brush that grew on it scraped against his horse's sides. On the way, he passed 2 other homesteads, and stopped at each one to ask if the people who lived there had seen the Barrow boy in the last few years. Both families gave him the same short answer. They kept to themselves and thought everyone else should do the same. One farmer stood in his doorway with his rifle clearly visible and made it clear that the sheriff was not welcome and that the Barrows' business was their own business. Galloway was up against a culture that kept everyone's secrets safe by keeping no one safe. As Galloway rounded a bend in the trail, the Barrow homestead suddenly came into view. The barn was strong, and the house looked well kept. A thin line of smoke rose from the chimney against the gray sky. When he got off his horse and tied it to a post, the front door opened, and the twin sisters came out onto the porch. They stood next to each other, their plain dresses and white aprons making them look the same. Their faces were blank as they watched him come closer. Galloway said who he was and why he was there. A worried relative who wanted to know how Thomas was doing. The sisters looked at each other quickly, and something passed between them without words. Then one of them spoke. She said that Thomas had left years ago, restless and eager to find work in the city. They hadn't heard from him since then. It was sad, but a lot of young men forgot about their family responsibilities once they got a taste of freedom. Galloway asked if he could talk to their dad. The sisters told him that Josiah was very sick, in bed, and couldn't have visitors. The sheriff asked a few more questions, like when exactly Thomas had left. Did he take anything with him? Did anyone see him on the road going to town? The answers were not clear and did not help. The sisters were still polite, but they were also cold. Their bodies were in the way of the door, making it clear that he would not be let in. Galloway looked past them into the dark house and saw only shadows and the edge of a plain wooden table. He had no legal reason to search the property, no proof of wrongdoing, and only an instinct that had been honed by years of following men who didn't want to be found. There was something wrong here, but he couldn't say what it was. He left the Barrow homestead as the sun was going down, riding back to Forsyth with more questions than answers. The investigation, as it was, had hit a wall right away because of the two problems of being alone and not working together. Months went by, and the Barrow case was pushed further and further back in Sheriff Galloway's mind. He wrote back to Martha Hendress in Illinois to let her know that her nephew had probably left the area years ago to look for work elsewhere. He also told her that the family hadn't heard from him, which was unfortunately common for young men starting new lives in growing cities. He didn't like the answer, but it was all he could give him at the time. The sheriff went back to his normal job, which included settling land disputes, looking into stolen livestock, and keeping the peace in a county where most people like to solve their own problems. Still, there was something about the Barrow sisters that bothered him. He couldn't stop thinking about how they had stood on the porch, two identical figures, blocking the door like guards at a tomb. He thought about how quiet that homestead was, how there had been no noise coming from the house the whole time he was there. In late summer, out of the blue, Dr. Edwin Cross went to Galloway's office for an unrelated reason. This was the first break in the case. Cross was an older man who had been a doctor in Tenney County for more than 30 years. He would ride out to remote homesteads to deliver babies and treat injuries that would have otherwise gone untreated. After their business was done, Cross stayed by the door, clearly struggling with something. Finally, he asked if the sheriff was still looking into the Barrow family. Galloway sat up straight in his chair, paying attention all of a sudden. Cross closed the door and sat back down. Even though they were alone, his voice dropped to a whisper. 2 years earlier, in 1894, he had been called to the Barrow homestead for a medical emergency. When he got there, one of the twin sisters was already in the last stages of labor. It had been hard and dangerous to give birth, and he had to use all of his skill to make sure the mother lived. He said that what bothered him was how secretive the event had been. The other sister blindfolded him for the last mile of the way, and she wouldn't answer any of his questions. Cross was told that the father was in bed in another room, but he never saw him. He was paid in cash after the delivery and blindfolded again for his departure, with strict orders not to talk about what had happened. Galloway leaned forward, and all of a sudden, his instincts kicked in. Did the doctor look at the kid? Cross shook his head. The other sister took the baby right away and wrapped it in blankets. He had only heard it cry once, a thin wailing sound, and then nothing else. He thought the child was being taken care of in another room, but the complete silence that followed seemed strange to him. Cross had to keep certain ethical obligations as a doctor when it came to patient privacy, which is why he didn't say anything for 2 years. But the sheriff's earlier visit and questions had made him worry. Where was that kid now? If one of the sisters had a baby, why had no one in the community ever seen it? And what about the dad? Who was he? And where was he now? The things Cross was saying hung over the room like a heavy weight. A child born in secret, a missing cousin, and a family that lived in complete silence behind walls. Galloway thanked the doctor and promised him that their talk would stay private. The sheriff sat alone in his office after Cross left, and the shadows grew longer on the floor as night fell. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but he didn't want to fully picture what they made. A young man shows up at a remote homestead and then vanishes. Years later, one of the women gives birth in a very secretive way. The timeline was helpful, but it didn't prove anything. Galloway had no reason to conduct a more thorough investigation because there was no body, no witness, and no physical evidence. In 1896, the law required more than just suspicion, and the Ozarks culture made it almost impossible to get information from people who didn't want to talk. If fate hadn't stepped in with a timber rattlesnake, the case might have stayed in this limbo forever, with a bunch of troubling facts that never turned into useful evidence. In early September, word reached Forsyth that Silas Barrow, the reclusive older brother who lived alone deep in the forest, had been found dead in his cabin by a trapper who occasionally traded with him. The death looked like it was caused by a snake bite, which is a common danger in the Ozarks, where timber rattlers grew to impressive sizes and made their homes in rocky outcroppings. Galloway had to look into any death that wasn't reported, even if it seemed simple. He set up a small party with himself and one deputy and rode out to Silas Barrow's property, following the trapper's instructions. Galloway thought the cabin would be more basic than it was. It looked like it could barely keep out the rain, let alone make people comfortable. They found Silas's body inside, where it was already starting to rot in the heat of late summer. It was easy to see the snake bite on his leg because it was swollen and discolored. There were no signs of foul play or any other people being there. It looked like what it was: a man living alone in the woods who had run into one of its many dangers and died. They wrapped the body up and got ready to take it back to town to bury it. He saw the well while his deputy walked around the small property's edge to make sure everything was safe. The wooden cover on the well was crooked, as if it had been put back on quickly. The well was 20 yards from the cabin. The deputy yelled at Galloway, saying that the move had just happened because the wood had fresh scrape marks on it. Wells in the Ozarks were very important for survival, so they were carefully cared for and kept clean. It was more than careless to leave a cover unsecured. It was dangerous. As Galloway got closer, he smelled something that was faint but unmistakable, even in the open air. It smelled like something was rotting, which was different from the natural decomposition going on inside the cabin. The sheriff and his deputy looked at each other, and the look said that they had been through a lot together in situations they didn't want to deal with. They took off the cover and looked down into the dark. The well was about 30 feet deep, and the water level was low because it was a dry summer. There was something big and pale near the bottom that was partly underwater. Galloway knew right away that they would need help and rope to get whatever was down there. It took another full day to get the recovery ready. They came back with more men from town and the right tools. They slowly pulled up a big bundle that was wrapped in what looked like heavy canvas or oilcloth and tied with rope that had been carefully tied. The bundle was soaked with water and very heavy, so it took 3 men to lift it onto solid ground. When they cut off the bindings, the canvas fell open to show what Galloway had already known they would find: 2 bodies that were so badly decomposed that it would have been impossible to identify them. Except for one important detail. They were dressed the same, and even after they died, they looked very much alike. The doctor who looked at the Barrow twins later said they had been in the well for about 3 months, maybe longer. It was hard to figure out exactly how the people died because of the state of their bodies, but there were no clear signs of violence, such as bullet wounds or knife marks. The first assessment pointed to drowning. but it was impossible to say for sure whether they had been in the water alive or dead. The news sent shockwaves through Tenney County. People quickly came to the conclusion that Silas Barrow had killed his sisters, put their bodies in his well, and then died before he could be caught. It was a neat explanation that fit the facts as they were first understood. People knew that Silas was strange and maybe even crazy. He lived like an animal in the woods. He might have been angry at his family for a long time, or an argument might have turned violent. The community, which was always quick to explain away darkness with the simplest story, quickly accepted this version of events. But as the men worked to make sure nothing else was left in the well, one of them felt something solid that wasn't stone or mud. He caught it with a long, hooked pole and carefully pulled it to the surface. It was a smaller package that was also wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax. It was clear that it was meant to keep water out. The package was flat and shaped like a book. When Galloway carefully opened it back at his office, he found a thick stack of papers with careful, feminine handwriting on them. The letter started without any kind of introduction or explanation of who it was meant for, as if the writer thought that whoever found it would already know what it was about. Sheriff Galloway took the pages to the window, where the light was strongest in the afternoon, and started to read. What happened in the next hour was a confession that changed the case from a simple murder to something much more disturbing. The handwriting was steady and clear, which made it seem like the letter had been written over time with a lot of thought, not in a moment of panic or need. The writer, who said her name was Barrow in the first few lines, began by saying that she and her sister would be dead by their own choice by the time anyone read these words. She said this account was necessary so that the truth would not die with them. She wrote about their father, Josiah, and the religious beliefs he had formed over years of being alone. These beliefs said that their family was chosen, holy, and needed to stay pure from the evil of the outside world. She talked about how this belief had grown stronger after their mother's death, almost to the point of insanity, even though they had believed it to be true at the time. Their father called them to his bedside when their cousin Thomas came, alone and vulnerable, and told them what he said was a message from God. Thomas was Providence's answer to their need to keep the family line going, without letting in bad blood from the sinful world outside their hollow. He was to be their husband in God's eyes, even if the law of men didn't agree. Maeve said they hadn't questioned this order because their parents had taught them never to question their father's understanding of what God wanted. The letter went into great detail about what happened next, which made it even more terrifying. Thomas had been locked up in the root cellar and chained up so he couldn't get out. They took turns bringing him food and water and doing what they thought was a holy duty, not a crime. Maeve's letter went on to talk about her pregnancy, which she said was proof that they were following God's plan. Dr. Cross helped the child be born in 1894, but the sisters made sure he didn't see much of him. What Maeve wrote next was the worst part of an already terrible story. The baby was born with very bad physical problems. She didn't say what was wrong, but she wrote that they knew right away that these problems were a sign that something had gone very wrong. Because their father's teachings and their own lack of exposure to any other point of view had completely warped their view of the world, they saw the child's condition as proof of demonic interference. They were sure that their brother Silas, whom they had always looked at with a mix of fear and suspicion, had somehow ruined the holiness of their mission. People thought that Silas was the wilderness, the wild and ungodly, and that his presence near their home had allowed evil to corrupt what should have been a pure and holy act. The letter told the story of what happened to the baby in a matter-of-fact way that was probably scarier than any emotional language could have been. They said they had done a purification ritual by taking the child deep into the woods to a place they thought was holy and killing it. Maeve wrote that they thought this was an act of mercy because it kept a demon-touched creature from living in a world where it would only suffer and spread evil. They buried the small body in an unmarked place that she didn't say, and they went home thinking they had done what they had to do. Thomas, who had seen or heard about what happened to the child he had fathered, stopped eating and talking within a few weeks. Maeve said he had just died, but she couldn't say if it was because of despair, illness, or on purpose. They had buried him in the same forest, in a grave that they would also go to when they died. The last part of the letter talked about how things got worse mentally after these events. Their father Josiah had died in his bed about 6 months after the baby died, but the sisters had not told anyone. They just buried him on the land and went on with their lives as if nothing had happened. But things had changed. Mavé said that they had started to notice signs that Silas knew what they had done. At dusk, they saw him looking at their home from the trees. They saw animal bones arranged in patterns outside their door, which they thought were signs of judgment and curse. It wasn't clear from the letter whether Silas really did these things or if the sisters were just getting paranoid, but their fear of their brother had grown to be all-consuming. They were sure he wasn't fully human and that he was some kind of supernatural being sent to punish them for a crime they couldn't figure out. They thought they had only done what their father told them to do and what God wanted them to do. The last few paragraphs of the letter explain why they chose to kill themselves. They couldn't go on living with Silas's judgment hanging over their heads and what they thought was a demonic presence watching them. They walked to his house while he was out hunting, knowing where he kept his spare key. They wrote this confession, sealed it well, and then climbed into the well. Maeve's last words were a prayer asking for forgiveness and understanding. She said they had always tried to do what was right based on what they had been taught. The letter stopped in the middle of a sentence. As if the writer couldn't finish her last thought, Sheriff Galloway put the pages down on his desk as the sun went down outside his window, making the room dark. He sat in the dark for a long time before turning on the light. The case was solved, but the solution didn't make anyone happy or bring justice. The criminals, their father who had planned the horror, and the victims who had suffered in the root cellar and the woods were all dead. Thomas's body and the baby's body were somewhere in the wilderness, but their graves were unmarked and probably impossible to find in the vastness of the Ozarks. Galloway would have to write to Martha Hendress in Illinois and tell her that her nephew had died, but he wouldn't tell her how he had died. He would have to choose what to tell the people, how much of the truth could be said out loud, and how much should stay hidden, like the bodies in the woods. The official record would say that Elizabeth and Maeve Barrow killed themselves while having a shared delusion about their brother. The sheriff's records would quietly keep the details of Thomas's captivity, the baby's death, and the sick religious reason for it all. Only a few officials who needed to know would see them. The Barrow homestead was left empty, with the door locked and the key missing. Someone set fire to the building within 10 years, but no one ever found out who. The fire destroyed the building and the root cellar where Thomas had been kept. People stayed away from the land itself, not because they knew the whole story, but because there were enough rumors going around that it was cursed ground.